Today, I'm going to be talking to Steve Taylor. Hi, Steve.
Hi there, Vic.
So, Steve, my traditional first question is, what do you do?
I'm a herbalist, a healer, a bit of a storyteller, and someone who I suppose tries to, share what you might call a holistic vision of the world with others around me.
Cool. That's a nice answer.
Yeah.
Nice and concise. So because obviously I'm familiar with your herbal work and stuff.
Yeah.
When did you, if we go right back to the beginning, would you say that you were sort of interested in stuff? I don't want to use the word alternative because that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. That's a little bit different from the mainstream.
Yeah.
Sort of early on, would you say?
I think probably yes. I think I probably was from a very young age. I always had an interest in the more what we might call sort of mystical or magical. The imaginative world was probably a big part of my world and always has been. So in a sense, I was always was always felt comfortable or familiar with things outside of the rigidly defined world that we sort of solidly live in and people continually validate with the way that they talk about the world.
Mm. So what's your earliest sort of recollection of life being like that, if you sort of mean?
I think, I have to certainly have my mother to thank for that, because she was quite an imaginative and sort of I don't want to use the word fanciful, but she loved the sort of more magical description of the world, and I think I really always warmed to that. I liked to it didn't seem problematic that the world was full of other beings, and potentially there were fairy beings or
okay.
other energies or spirits around. So yeah, I always had a sort of a happiness to sort of see the world with that kind of cue on it, if you like.
And you would say that's your mother's?
I think so. I mean, my mother was born in India to a military father. She herself became a ballerina very, very young in her life, and professional ballet dancer. And so she was always living, I suppose that world is also, it's exploring a lot of myth and story, and storytelling is a big part of it, poetry, music. So I think that probably overflowed quite a lot into the way that, she brought us up.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think that's something that we sort of forget, really, being involved in something like ballet. I mean, the stories, they're all extraordinarily magical,
fantastical, and
absolutely.
I think the influence of music and the way that moved her, and the way that I think she shared that quite a lot just in who she was.
So she obviously moved to England before you were born.
Oh, way before. Yeah, she came to England, I think, when she was 6 or 7. I think that was just at the beginning, just pre-war, and spent her childhood in England during the war.
That was a bit of a shock, I should think, coming from India to
I think so. I remember the one story she told, which was obviously very strong for her. So her father, when they crossed the equator, he took the hat. They have those cork hats. I forgot what the proper name is now. That they all wore in India.
Yeah, like a pith helmet type of thing. You mean? Is it?
Yeah. And he took it off her head and threw it into the sea as they crossed the equator. And of course, she was totally heartbroken.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting. Yeah. How bizarre.
So yeah, I think coming back to England was probably quite a shock for her, and her immersion in ballet was probably an escape from that kind of big kind of shock and kind of quite rude awakening it must have been.
Yes. Yeah. That is. Yeah. I think it's when we reflect back on our parents' lives as we get older.
Yeah.
You start to see the impact that certain events must have had on them, and I think
and how those have then reflected down the generations.
Yeah, exactly, and because I don't think people of those generations tended to talk very much about things so much, did they?
I don't think sort of self-analysis was a big thing.
No, I don't think it featured very highly in stuff at all. Yeah, so where did you grow up then, Steve?
I grew up in London, in North London, in Camden Town.
Oh, right. So that's interesting.
It was quite, considering it was a city upbringing. It was actually quite an outdoor one. I spent a lot of time out on the street. I was born, in the 1960s. There was a lot less kind of traffic.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time out on the streets with friends playing. Camden was a lot of a big Irish immigrant community there. And I remember it. I remember it with a lot of fondness, and it was. Maybe I've got as we get older, maybe we have a rose-tinted view of our childhood. But I do remember some lovely things. I remember having the window cleaner, Mr. East, who used to come regularly, and I remember the rag and bone man with his horse and his bell.
Yeah. I think in actual fact that was something about, because I know that things that Susan said about living in well, she was living in Wapping, but it sounded like it was more of a little community within a city, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was still very village-like. There was the local market was a fruit and veg market, and it was being passed down the generation. The people who worked in the market, and they knew everyone by name. It was. They were. I mean, London was still very much like smaller communities and villages, all just joined together.
Yeah. So when how long were you in London then before you because you don't live there now, obviously? But
no, I live in Chichester now. I was in London really until to my early 20s, although I had quite a strong connection with Chichester because my grandmother and so my mother's aunts, uncles, my grandmother, they'd all been based, and her father as well, they'd all come from Chichester.
All right.
So she'd come back here for a period during her childhood. Being an army family, had also moved around. So I'd always been familiar with Chichester because we visited my grandmother and great aunts and great uncles and other people who lived in this area. So I ended up here when my grandmother and great aunt died. I had been sort of one member of my mother's generation. She was in America at that point, had moved to America. Her brothers and sisters were in Australia and also America. So I was kind of one of the few family members who could kind of keep an eye on the elders of the family, come and do shopping and dig the garden and things. So when they passed on for a while, I lived for a few years actually in my grandmother's house.
Right.
So that's how I came to be back down in Chichester, and I'd wanted, although I'd lived in London up until my sort of early 20s, I had a strong urge to get into the countryside and to live in the countryside. I went to, when I was 11 years old, I went to a boarding school in Sussex. Called Christ Hospital, which was really because my my parents being quite aspirational, sort of aspirational middle class parents, wanted me not to go. At that time, all the schools in London were basically going into a comprehensive system, and the one that I would have gone to, which was Haverstock Hill, had a pretty poor reputation. And so my father tutored me to take entrance exams at all the possible schools that I might get a scholarship for, because they didn't really have enough money to send me to a private school.
Yeah.
And I got a scholarship to Christ Hospital, which happened to be in Horsham in West Sussex.
Right.
So at the age of 11, that's where I ended up.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Really, what was your experience of? Because I've had a few people say I went to a public school, or I boarded in a public school, and it's always a bit like, what was your experience of the school? Was it all right?
Well, no, it wasn't. Well, I mean, there's always good and bad, isn't there? And there was I had some fantastic times there, and there were one or two fantastic teachers. The overall experience, I would say, probably was mainly traumatic and pretty challenging. But out of that, I think there's a lot of good things. The learning independence, learning self-reliance.
Yeah.
You have to learn a lot very, very quickly. It's a bit like it's a bit like being thrown into the military or something.
Yeah.
There's a regime, and you have to learn to follow that, and there's a strict hierarchy. You have to learn how you're going to survive in it. And so, from that point of view, it's a tough but potentially a very positive learning experience.
Okay. So where's you already said that you were very sort of open-minded to things from very early on. Where would you say the beginnings of what you could sort of see as what you became later? Where's that positioned in these early years, would you say?
I think it came from, that experience of being sent away from home into that situation started to, there were a lot of things that when I first went there, I mean, I had a fantasy vision of it being all, jolly good chaps all being jolly nice together. Yeah. Which was pretty much shattered within the first minute of arriving.
Yes. I can imagine.
So I think I quite quickly discovered that a way of dealing with that for me, because I didn't have physically, I could look after myself to some degree, but being physically quite small, I had to develop ways of dealing with the situation. And one of those ways, actually, I discovered quite quickly was I suppose putting forward or a certain level of bravado, devil may care attitude, and having quite an adventurous spirit, I suppose. And so I quite quickly got into subverting rules and regulations, and quite quickly found that with older boys that by doing that, and in a sense, I suppose, by being the one who was young enough and naive enough to take risks that they knew were that I didn't realize the consequences of, but I could be, I'd step up. And so,
like what? Like what?
There was some rather daft things, like close to the school there was a large area where during the 60s in the beaching cuts with the railway line, there was a large area of sidings at the station that was close to the school. and those sidings had been turned into a depot for a company that was a major wholesaler of beer.
Ah, I thought there might have been some sort of alcohol or something involved. I just was wondering.
Although actually I didn't really partake of drinking a lot of beer, I did a little bit. I was, small and nimble enough to be quite good at getting over fences.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Being able to keep an eye out. And so, I was sort of a lookout for a whole group of kids who were very much, what could you say, didn't care too much about the legality of what they were doing.
No.
And so by doing that, of course, once you fall in with, if you like, the more, I don't know, the kids who've got a reputation,
Yeah.
of course, that's a ticket to your own protection. No one's going to,
yeah, it is.
Because you're seen as a gang of tougher lads.
Yeah, exactly.
I think from that point of view, I kind of was already sort of a bit interested in the excitement and the interest of subverting authority, and that fed into a kind of questioning attitude of anything that then came up. So yeah, I think that certain, maybe there were seeds there already of a greater openness.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, actually.
Yeah. And then I was very lucky because at the age of 1976, I was 14. And of course, in London, Camden Town, what happened is the whole punk movement exploded. And at that point, my mother had actually moved to the States because there were better opportunities for her as a ballet mistress. So my uncle was there and she went to work with him. So when I went home, there was suddenly a vacuum of parental control, which I took great advantage of and was able to really enjoy a lot of what was happening in Camden and the music scene at the time.
Yeah.
From the age of sort of 14 onwards.
Right.
So my holidays often when I was in London would be sneaking out and spending a lot of time, going into Dublin Castle and Electric Ballroom through the back door, or and so it was a very exciting time for me. And at times there seemed to be a lot of creativity and possibility and freedom in that way.
I think actually that's one of those things that we've sort of gets overlooked at that period, that sort of punk sort of thing. There was a lot of creativity available and possible because there were opportunities. There were a lot of people, I knew a lot of people that had lived in squats and stuff like that in London.
Yeah.
A lot of people that were involved in the arts that were on the dole.
Yeah.
And it gave them the possibility to sort of hone their skills and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think I've actually heard somebody mention that before, but I think that's a really important point of why we had that upwelling of artistic development. Not just to do with music, it was also to do literally with artists and stuff like that.
I think so.
Yeah, so the punk period, and then obviously all the stuff that followed on.
Yeah. It was very, very exciting times. It sort of changed quite radically after the election of Margaret Thatcher, and then the change of the Falklands War, and London changed quite a lot from. It became a much darker place. Yes,
it did. It did. We'll leave Margaret Thatcher parked safely to one side, I think. So what did you first do, sort of work-wise, or
Well, I wanted to. I didn't really want a job. I was having too much fun. I wanted to stay in London. So I went to uni. I've been, one of the benefits of going to a private school is you hopefully have the opportunity to. So I didn't get fantastic qualifications, A levels, but I was good enough to be able to go to to King's College in London because I wanted to go to a London uni. I wanted to stay in London. I did. I was also very interested. There was a whole aspect in my life that also was very interested in spirituality, and obviously the school I'd went to had a very strong church background.
Yeah.
But I kind of was quite interested for a period in exploring Christianity, and I was very interested in I suppose the revolutionary aspects of Christianity, of the overturning of the traditional ways of the early Christian church, the kind of idea of living in community, the sort of radical sharing, all of that kind of stuff. And that attitude to me was very exciting. And I was, so I ended up going to King's College doing philosophy and theology. But after about 6 weeks of theology, I decided that certainly wasn't for me, because it really was straightforward theology, learning New Testament Greek, and any of the excitement and interest in exploring theology, from a more broad spiritual perspective wasn't available. And I managed to persuade the professor of philosophy at the time, against his better judgment, that he should allow me to do pure philosophy rather than philosophy and theology. Right. And so I ended up doing philosophy at King's College for 3 years. And at the same time, I set up, with a group of other students, we set up a housing cooperative for students, and took on a property in East London, in Victoria Park, in Hackney, with 7 other students that we ran as a housing cooperative. Wow. And lived together, which was a good place, and a lot of radical stuff going on, a lot of radical politics, a lot of partying. Yeah, so it was a good time. Enjoyed it a lot.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, sounds really amazing.
I'm very lucky.
So it sounds like you enjoyed the course, at King's. Once you got the theology out of the way.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I really enjoyed it. I found it very confusing. It was really tough, because, philosophy is not what I now understand philosophy to be, which is, a path of, it's a mystical path of enchantment, to do with the philos, the love of the goddess Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. It's a path of the heart. Whereas, of course, it was a completely intellectual exercise, which I didn't have the tools really to deal with. So I spent pretty much 2 years trying to understand what the hell anyone was talking about. By the time I did, I had to basically get myself ready to pass the exams. So, it was great that I did it. It taught me about logic and analytical thinking. I think I gained a lot from it. But yeah, I was quite happy to leave academic philosophy behind when I left, and I finished the course.
See, there's an interesting thing there, because obviously philosophy, as you pointed out, really is something other than what you end up studying as philosophy.
Yeah.
In university, and I would say actually there's something very similar about music. With regards to this, because you could go and study music and not actually really get to the grips of what really music is. I know that's because you just get bogged down in the sort of the logic of it all.
Yes, definitely.
And this is, I'm sure, is true of many art forms. I've spoken to a few artists who sort of hint at the same thing, really.
Yeah, but, definitely.
And unfortunately, the people tend to, how can you put this, sort of dictate the terms and conditions of these things, tend to be the rather snobby about what they believe in, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I think that might be just something to do with human nature. And obviously, if you're trying to write a plan, a course syllabus or whatever, you have to, by its very nature, I guess, you end up falling into that trap.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, I think I appreciate that, because I know that when you look at any traditional program of apprenticeship or learning, a big part of it is learning almost parrot fashion a set of stuff.
Yes.
You
Oh
know,
yeah. Yeah.
and that has to be learned. It's a bit like the development of mastery of a discipline.
Yes.
That has to be done. You can't practice herbal medicine without actually understanding how not to poison people or
Yes.
make them worse.
Yes.
And that is done through learning information, through absorbing other people's knowledge, wisdom, and experience. And that actually can be given in a very, very, prosaic, prose-like form rather than the poetic form, as raw information. And one might just have to learn it that way. It's what happens beyond that that's the important thing.
That's the point. Because what I was going to say is I agree with that. But when that becomes the only thing,
Yeah, the dogma.
that is the only thing that matters. And I think that's what goes on. That's what I've experienced with
Yeah,
that.
certainly.
Because obviously any apprenticeship involves, as you say, whether you were a carpenter back in the day, stonemason, whatever, is the actual physical thing. But what you end up with when you become a master of that isn't just that, is it? There's something that comes out of that which you can't, well, seemingly you can't really measure somehow.
No.
So I think that's the thing. But unfortunately, once you, well, again, it's back to that idea of this, the logos mythos thing.
Exactly.
You've got to get that balance in there, and unfortunately, the logic tends to think that it's the only kid on the block somehow. For a lot of them.
Yes.
So okay, so you've got this. You've graduated or whatever we're going to call it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did.
What happens next?
What next is I set up a screen printing workshop in by this point it sort of evolved out of the housing cooperative into squatting, mainly because the housing cooperative had become very bureaucratic, and what had happened is the people who had set it up ended up being the administrators, even to the extent of having to even consider evicting people who had joined the co-op but refused to pay any rent, which wasn't what I was interested in doing. So I left that and actually became, I think also politically at the time there was a lot of stuff going on with the belief that houses shouldn't be left empty. There was a lot of empty houses around. So it's also a political statement to be squatting at that time. And I set up with my partner Zoe. We set up a screen printing workshop, and we started printing T-shirts, and to try and make some money selling them, which actually was never particularly successful. And in the meantime, I picked up, having done a lot of repairing of houses as part of the housing cooperative, I picked up, quite a bits and pieces of work to do with renovation, building work, that kind of stuff. And that way kind of put a bit of money together. And then probably I think and I was really interested in travel. I'd done travel, I'd done interrail, obviously something that young people did a lot at that time. I had, from the age of 12, because my mother had gone to the States in the summer holidays, I went to stay with a family, which was the mother of the family had been my au pair girl when I was 3 or 4. And she was a Swiss girl, and she lived in a town in Switzerland. And so I went there ostensibly to learn French and be an au pair for her 2 young children and to help out with her. She had a couple of shops in the town. And so I used to spend a month in Switzerland to learn French. I had a great time there, but I had this big taste for traveling, for being in different countries. And so I really wanted to do more of that. And so Zoe and myself, I by that point I was driving a motorbike. We loaded our bike up and we drove down across Spain, because her uncle had, who worked as a buyer for a company in the UK for vegetables in Spain, had a small little house that he had bought in a Spanish village in southern Spain, and they offered us to go and stay there for the winter. So we went down to Spain for the winter, and had a very, very, very interesting experience in a very still a very kind of, it was still at the end of this is sort of 84. So it was, so just as Spain had joined the common market, so it was still, the village was still families making a living from farming the terraces. And although there were a couple of houses that had been bought up by English people and others, it was still mainly a Spanish village. And it had a bar, which was served as a shop. And so, we spent a lot of time getting to know the local villagers, enjoying time in the bar, drinking, and getting under the skin of what it's like to live in a village like that. Which was a really interesting experience, really lovely, and sort of inspired me to want to do more traveling, and Zoe as well. So really, after that, having returned to the UK, it was really to try and earn money to do more traveling, explore more places.
Yeah.
So after that, I came back. I then, for my sins, I became a dispatch rider in London because I had a motorbike. Saved up, and about a year later, we went off to South America to do some backpacking, knowing nothing about South America, but having learned some Spanish in Spain, thought, well, that's quite a good place because we sort of speak the language a bit. So traveling was sort of at that time in my life, for both Zoe as well, for both of us, that was our real sort of focus, to sort of get out there, explore, and get to sort of I suppose it was a bit of an exploration and adventure.
Yes.
We'd also, again, on the sort of spiritual side, I'd sort of moved on from theology and Christianity. My parents being of the sort of 50s, 60s generation, my dad had been one of the original students of the Maharishi and had done meditation. Yeah. So their bookshelves were full of books such as books, like Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, the Carlos Castaneda series, which I had kind of avidly read, and Zoe had avidly read. So that side of things, interested in the sort of esoteric, the mystical, the spiritual, of course, in South America also was sort of something which attracted us to go there.
So did you have much luck there on that?
It was another really interesting learning experience, because of course we were too small, too very young, green, gringos. In fact, they all of the in Ecuador, they actually used to rather endearingly call us gringuitos, because of the small gringos.
That's nice.
So we did quite a lot of off-piste traveling. We tried to do backpacking, but usually ended up lost in the middle of nowhere, exhausted and hungry, and then had to find a way back. But it was a great experience. It was tough traveling. Now, obviously, there's a lot of challenges with a lot of people trying to rip you off, and scams and all of that kind of stuff going on. We bumped into quite a lot of other people who were traveling, had quite a few different adventures. So it was a really interesting, but not what I'd expected experience. But probably also it really tied in with, I mean, I was it always, certainly the great thing that I gained from going to school in Sussex was I mean, I suppose for solace, during those times, the one escape was the countryside, because it was surrounded by very beautiful countryside. So I had always felt a very strong connection with the countryside and nature, and going to nature to get away from trauma and difficulty. So exploring natural environments, being in inspiring and beautiful natural places was a big part of it. And we went into the Ecuadorian Amazon to see, we see what we could of the rainforest. And it was while there that I really had my first experience of herbal medicine, which at the time didn't necessarily make me think, oh, this is what I'm going to do. But what had happened was that my partner Zoe had got very, very sick with some form of dysentery. And we were staying in one of those end of the road hostels, where in a small village called Misawai, where the road ended. It was at a confluence of two rivers. One was the Rio Napo, and so the road couldn't go any further. There wasn't a road bridge. So everyone ended up there and got into the pirogues, the dugout canoes, to go further into the rainforest. And so we were stuck in a hostel there that was a sort of, transit hostel for people going through. Had water for 1 hour a day. And the shower basically had a captive parrot that lived on a chain. So that was always a bit worrying, with a single toilet. So to be really sick, it wasn't a good place to be really sick. And at night the cockroaches would come out and the rats would be running along the ceiling. And so I bumped into another traveller who was passing through, who said, oh, do you not know there's a very nice little hostel on the edge with 4 bedrooms on the edge of the village, run by a mestizo woman who's half Indian and half Latin. And it's really clean. They've got their own spring. The food's good, and there's no cockroaches or bed bugs. So I said, yeah, that sounds good. So I went and found the place and spoke to the woman, and there was a room available. And so I literally carried Zoe across the square and down the road and down the track to there. And when I got to the hostel, the woman who ran it immediately saw how sick she was, and she said to me, what's going on with her? And I explained that she'd been really sick and had constant diarrhea and vomiting, and we'd been to the pharmacia in the town. I bought every single medicine that we could buy because if you got the money, you can buy anything over the counter there. And every time we tried it, nothing had stopped her diarrhea, and she was getting weaker and sicker. And so the woman said, "Oh, quickly put her to bed." And I went to collect our luggage and other stuff and take it up there. By the time I got there, she presented me with a glass of sort of golden coloured liquid, a bit like sort of the colour of my herbal tea I've got here. So give her this to drink. And I said, "Oh, fine. What is it?" She said, "It's sucus de planta, plant juice." And so I said, "Oh, okay, I'll do that." And I gave it to her. I mean, we'd just do anything because she was very unwell. And interestingly, from that point onwards, she stopped having diarrhea. For the first time, she slept all through the night. She woke up in the morning, and the first thing she said is, "Oh, I'm really hungry. Let's go and find some breakfast."
That is amazing.
That absolutely miraculous change.
Yeah. So what was in there?
Well, I believe it was a plant juice from a plant called Kanya, because later on, when I was researching rainforest remedies, I came across something, and I'm pretty sure that's what it was. Yeah. So yeah, it was one of those things that, looking back on it, was probably something which really opened my eyes to a way that I could be involved with the nature that I'd felt so close to, and to be able to also potentially maybe earn a living by doing something that respects and honors nature. rather than just you know, destroys nature, which obviously is something that's been such a big problem in our lifetimes.
Exactly. So you come back from South America.
Yep, came back from South America. We then squatted in Brighton for a while. And that was great, but wasn't all that, because by that time things changed a lot. The squatting movement had changed a lot. Laws were starting to change. We had quite a lot of it. We were very organized squatters. You know, we had furniture. We were very well sussed, and we knew how to. We actually managed to get a kind of semi-license on a property that was an empty property owned by the post office in Brighton. We had a kind of spoken agreement eventually with them that they'd let us live there because they were just leaving it empty, wanting to redevelop the whole area, which wasn't popular with the local residents. So we were kind of, you know, people were happy that we were in there, stopping the house from falling down. And then we were kind of rudely evicted by the legal department when the Postmaster General of Brighton went on sabbatical. The day after he left, the legal department brought a High Court injunction against us, and we were thrown out of the property immediately with no notice and lost all of our possessions. So that was quite interesting. So at that point, we decided to go back to Spain, and we out of the blue, we decided a good way to travel, because we were a bit fed up of backpacking. We tried that and it was quite hard work, and you ended up having to just shove stuff on buses. We decided it might be a good idea to try it out on bicycles. So we had enough money to buy a couple of bicycles, and our plan was to cycle across France and Spain and hopefully pick up some work on the way, and head back down to the south of Spain that we knew so well. So we started that trip, and it, in fact, really were unable to pick up any work and ended up surviving off a very small amount of money, feeding ourselves off peas in northern France, cherries in southern France, figs as we got to Spain, any way we could. I mean, we were living off £5 a day, and camping wild. And it was a wonderful, again, an incredible experience. Being on a bicycle, you have to stop when you're tired. So we slept under bushes, slept in tunnels, slept in caves, slept in the back of people's gardens, you name it, as we made our way down through France and Spain. But that really opened our eyes to what a great way traveling on a bicycle was. You smelt everything. You literally, you got to really know where you were going and what you were passing through. So it was kind of a very tough, but also quite a magical experience. You know, times where you're just sleeping in places you wouldn't have slept if you had a car, because you keep driving till you got to the next town. So with that in mind, we decided to come back and earn more money to do a bigger cycle trip.
Yeah.
So we then came back, didn't want to squat because it was too much bother by then and pretty difficult to do.
So what are we talking about now, years-wise, roughly?
This is now 86, 87. And we what we did was so, you know, 87 this was, in fact, just as the Great Storm happened in the UK, we'd got back. We bought a van, which we lived in, and my brother-in-law, who was a builder, just as the Great Storm had happened, his building business suddenly took off, and as a way of supplementing his income, he'd been a window cleaner. So he gave us his window cleaning round, and we lived in our van and drove round the villages in Sussex cleaning windows.
Right.
So that was great. So we parked up and, you know, all over the place, and spent our evenings wandering in the woods and on the downs, etc. We always used to organise it, so we had 1 week free a month, and we'd drive off to Wales or the New Forest, or and that way our overheads were low. We saved what we could, and So then in the following year, we had enough money to take another trip, and a friend of Zoe's happened to have gone to Kenya in Africa to teach English. So we thought, well, that'll be interesting. Let's go to Africa. We'll take our bikes, maybe cycle around. She was in Kenya. We thought we'll cycle around Kenya, you know, maybe do a bit of Tanzania or something. We'll see what happens. Spend a few months just exploring, and then get a flight home. So we bought a one-way ticket to Nairobi, chucked our bikes in the aeroplane, and flew to Nairobi. Showed that we had a wodge of travelers' checks and money, even though we didn't have return flights. So we got, you know, a 3-month visa in Kenya, and then you know, straightened our bikes out at the airport and cycled into Nairobi from the airport, and then started a trip cycling across Africa.
Wow, amazing.
Which was interesting, which was again great fun. I mean, very, very scary.
Yeah,
the first time we left Nairobi, we were too scared to stop, really.
yeah.
But Africans are very friendly people, and they all seem to see, as soon as they saw it, everyone smiled. In fact, most people smiled so much they seemed to start laughing, and then even fall on the ground laughing. We couldn't quite understand quite what was going on. But there were lots of people on bicycles, and they were joining us and chatting, and everyone wanted to know where you come from and where you were going and what you were doing and why you were on a bicycle and all kinds of stuff like that. And after a good few hours, we were chatting to a very friendly chap, and he said, "Oh, I've got to stop here. This is where I'm going." And I said to him, "Oh, before you leave us, could you answer a question for me?" And he said, "Oh yeah, what's that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's nice to see all these happy people laughing all the time, but what is so funny? Why are they just everyone's laughing?" And he said, "Oh, don't you know?" And I said, "No, I haven't got a clue." And he said, "It's because of you." I said, "What do you mean it's because of us?" And he said, "It's because you're on a bicycle." And I said, "Well, what's so funny about that?" He said, well, you know, we've never seen a white person on a bicycle.
I thought that's what you were going to say.
So it's really funny because everyone here believes the reason that white people drive around in cars is because no white people know how to ride a bike. So yeah, that was why they were laughing. Man. So Africa was really, I mean, we went through Africa, we went through Kenya. We soon discovered that where the more off-road you went, the more interesting it got. The roads anyway started to deteriorate as you kind of got out of the main drag, really. And we ended up heading into Uganda. We met another cyclist who had come from Zaire and had said that it's possible to ride into Zaire, into the rainforest. And there was a new road that had been built, although it wasn't open to motorized traffic, that could take you down through into Burundi and then back into Tanzania and then possibly back into Kenya. So we thought, well, that sounds like quite an interesting route. We'll do that. And he said it actually passes the Ruwenzori Mountains, and he had actually seen a mountain gorilla on his bicycle. So we thought, well, that sounds great. We'll go and try that. So we headed off into Uganda, and Uganda was again quite an amazing trip. It was just after the civil war had finished in Uganda. The place was pretty much ravaged by AIDS. And at one point in Uganda, we had a terrible accident, and at that point we suddenly realized that, you know, life was pretty, we were on a pretty, you know, there was, you either did it or you didn't. At that point, we either gave up because it was dangerous and just went home, or we just said, okay, this is what it is, and let's just go day by day. It was quite an interesting story. I'll just tell you the story, and it's a bit of a tangent. But what had happened was we'd left Kampala, and as we left Kampala, there were lots of young lads on very old sit up and beg, British-made bicycles. In fact, they're now made in Africa with the lever brakes. And what they would do, the young lads would go out of Kampala to buy charcoal to take back to the city, because they made their living through selling charcoal. So they'd put about 5 or 6 sacks of charcoal on the back of the bicycle, ride out to the bush to buy from the charcoal burners, and then push it back to Kampala and then sell it the next morning. So you always had a crew of young lads on these really rubbish bicycles that were in poor condition. And what they found to be great sport was that because there were these two whiteys, Mzungus is the name that we were known at, we were called white people, on kind of posh bikes. Yeah, we had a lot of luggage, but the game was to cycle up from behind us and race and see who could beat us first. And then 100 meters on, they would one of them would lose their chain, and they'd all stop to help him put his chain back on. We'd cycle past at our slow rate, and then again they would all get on their bikes and they'd have another race to see who could be the next one to beat us. And they were very friendly, and it was a bit annoying hour after hour. And the roads in Uganda were very good. They'd been built by the British, and they were really good roads. And so we get to one point where there's a very, very long uphill, and with our multiple gears, we could ride up the hill, whereas they all had to actually get off their bikes because the chains would come off. So we got to the top of the hill, having left them way behind, and we thought, well, okay, we're not going to let them catch us. So as we went down the hill, we kind of went onto our, top gear, and we were pedaling really, really hard, as fast as we possibly could. As we came down the hills, we went around the corner. What we then discovered was the road suddenly ended, because during the war, the road had been mined. And so it suddenly finished, and it turned into basically a whole range of dirt tracks. Anyone driving the road would know that and would know how to pick their way through. Of course, we didn't know it. The tarmac suddenly ended, and both of us hit rocks and just went flying. And I remember seeing literally Zoe flying off her bike behind me and kind of landing on her face with all of her luggage going everywhere. And just as we hit the ground, we hear from behind us the African lads who are coming down through the dirt track. But of course, they know the way through. Their brakes don't work anyway, so they couldn't stop. And so they just went shooting past us in a cloud of dust. And there we were left with with the dust settling around us, looking at see if we'd broken anything. We were both bleeding, cut. All our stuff was all over the place. We picked our bikes up. I'd blown out my front tire. And so we dragged ourselves to a bit of green by the side of the road and started to sort ourselves out. And after a couple of minutes, a really weird thing happened, because from literally behind a bush, a traditional woman popped up, a Ugandan woman. She was wearing very colourful traditional Ugandan dress. And in this amazing high falsetto voice, she started to go into this sort of operatic performance. And we were completely dumbfounded. And very quickly, even though we seemed to be in the middle of the bush, a large number of people seemed to appear from nowhere. And they were all watching this performance. And the performance clearly was something about us, because she kept pointing at us and telling different things and adding a bit of song. And everyone was cheering and laughing and joining in. And through her action, she was making cycling actions, and she was making, we started to realize she was telling our story. And that as we'd been cycling across Africa and through Kenya and through Uganda, everywhere we'd stopped and slept, sometimes we'd been invited into villages, sometimes being looked after by different people. The story that had been happening with us had passed on with us. We could only cycle 20 odd miles a day. And so the story had carried on as people walked from village to village. They told about these strange white people.
That's amazing.
And so she was there, and of course in Africa, they're really something that's also we understood. I mean, we were crying, we were in pain, and everyone was around us enjoying this story and laughing. And actually, although it felt like they were laughing at us, actually they were laughing with us. They were trying in a way to show that all the stuff that had happened was something very joyful and wonderful about it all, and we were alive and we'd survived this as well. And it completely changed our whole perception of what was going on this journey. And from then on, the journey took on a completely different colour. And instead of being worried about people and scared of this and scared of that, nothing worse could happen in a way. We survived the worst, and we kind of just threw ourselves into it.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story.
And so we were about 7 months in the journey, and we ended up in northern Nigeria, hoping, in a sense, we were thinking maybe we can cycle across or hitch a ride on a lorry across the Sahara and cycle back into Europe. But by that point, our 21 gear bikes, my bike by that point had 3 usable gears left. And to change gear, I had to physically move the chain by hand. We were exhausted. Our bikes were pretty knackered. Zoe had had a very bad bout of malaria. I'd had quite a lot of problems with parasites. So we were very weakened, and we actually didn't have enough money to pay for what it would cost to get across the Sahara. So fortunately, we met some expats in Nigeria who knew other expats who were involved in the travel business, and we managed to get a discount flight back to the UK from northern Nigeria. And so we found ourselves back in the UK, and immediately came to Chichester because my great aunt at that point was dying of cancer. So we moved into her house in Chichester, and then stayed there for the next 4 years. And it so happened that we started a family. What was interesting about all of that story is the one thing that had been a constant in Africa is whenever we arrived in a village, everyone would look down the road and say, well, where are your children?
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to explain to Africans that we didn't want children, because that just doesn't compute to Africans at all. It's like, well, why wouldn't you want children? Everyone wants children. So, the women would take Zoe off and feed her something that would obviously make her a bit stronger. And all the chaps would huddle around me and put their arms on my shoulder and pat me on the back and look me in the eye and say, don't worry, you're still young yet.
Yeah.
You reckon there's some very kindly African family that we'd stayed with, and maybe one of the ones we'd given T-shirts to or left some food with, in return had done a very kind thing and had gone to see the local sangom or the witch doctor, and had a fertility charm made for us, because as soon as we got home, without intending to, Zoe actually fell pregnant. And so once you have kids, of course, thoughts of continuing to travel across Africa on bicycles sort of evaporate. And it was at that point that someone happened to literally put in front of me a leaflet from the National Institute of Medical Herbalists about training as a herbalist. And I thought, well, I don't want to try and earn a living cleaning. At that time, that's what we were just working as cleaners as soon as we came back to the UK to earn a bit of cash. I wanted to put my energies into something that I felt was going to be positive and could potentially maybe support us as a family. I'd looked into conservation, but there's very little going on in the conservation world at that time, and the door was shut unless you had a degree in conservation management. I didn't have any of the qualifications. So I thought, well, why not? I'll train as a herbalist. I'm already into all of that stuff. So love nature, interested in plants. And that's when, the former experiences such as in South America made me really, I was already a convert, you could say. And now I had a path to follow. And so that's what led me into becoming a herbalist. So
what are we talking about now, sort of time-wise, roughly?
So now so we came back to the UK at that point in my late 20s. So I started training as a herbalist at 28 and qualified when I was 32.
So this is obviously what I know you as anyway, as a herbalist.
Yeah.
So what how long was it before you really thought, yeah, this is definitely it? Because obviously having that leaflet put in front of you at that point in time must have made you go like, this is interesting, right at this point. But
I think as soon as I started studying, I knew that it was something I would be. I didn't really know if I would actually practice it or whether I would be involved in some other way in herbs, but I knew it was something that I was passionate about, that I could be passionate about. I knew it was something that really respected nature, that could contribute to people developing a healthy relationship with the planet we live in. So immediately I felt a strong attachment, and I was very fortunate. I met a chap who then became my mentor, a chap called Christopher Headley, who was a qualified herbalist and a teacher, and he actually lived in Camden Town, although I'd never met him. And he was available for students to call upon to run workshops, and with another local herbalist who's training but was a bit ahead of me, a lovely woman called Veg, who lived in Southampton. She arranged a workshop which Christopher came to teach on making comfrey ointment. And so I went to that workshop, met Christopher, and from meeting him, I knew immediately that, I mean, he really embodied a kind of herbal medicine that I really immediately felt very, very attracted to. So it was one which was strongly founded and based in an understanding of if you like, our modern analytical viewpoint of herbs, but really taking its inspiration from traditional usage, from folk usage, and from if you like, a historical relationship that we've had with plants. So to see that all embodied in one practitioner who was clearly very experienced and very effective was very good for me at that point. It was a great inspiration.
So yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that was so the first real herbal thing I probably made really was with Christopher Headley. I made some comfrey ointment, and I soon actually had an opportunity to use it, because when I came home, a friend of mine, his mother had been in bed for 6 weeks with a bad back, and he asked me, he said, "Oh, all this herbal stuff you do, is there anything you can do for my mum, because she's such a pain at the moment?" And I said, "Oh, look, you must try some of this comfrey ointment I've just made on this workshop." And I gave him this pot of comfrey ointment, and he took it back to his mum. Anyway, literally a few days later, he came around and said, "My mum thinks you're fantastic." That she used that ointment, and within a day, she felt better, and she's up and about and doing everything as normal. She's really, really happy with it. In fact, she wants to give you something, and she said she's going to give me something to bring you around. I thought, great, this is really good. Not only am I helping people and working with plants, but I might earn something. I'm very impoverished at the time as a student and trying to work part-time, and we had obviously young kids at that point. And so a few days later, he turned up with the gift for me, and to my complete consternation, rather than any money or anything that might have been quite useful, it was a bag of grapes that he'd half eaten on the way round.
Oh, lovely.
So I did get something, but
not what you expected. Yeah,
not what I hoped for, but still, it was quite funny.
Yeah.
So that was my that was really sealed it for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you finished your training, then was it, did you sort of set up as a practice?
Yeah, I mean, I was quite lucky, because again, Zoe seems to be quite fortuitous in my life. I mean, it was her mum that gave me the leaflet. It was her that was sick in South America that introduced me to the first plant medicine. And also when we'd first known each other, she had been training as a dancer, contemporary dancer, and she suffered a very bad back injury. And as a way of helping her, I managed to give her a bit of massage to help. She's in a lot of pain. There was a chap who was the masseur at the company where she was training, the London Contemporary Dance Theatre, who was a dance masseur. And he was running a course, and she said, "Oh, there's this chap Ken, who's the masseur for the company, who's running a course in massage. Why don't you do it? Because you're helping me already, and it would be great if you could, get a few tips from him." So I went along and did. In fact, it's the first course that he ever ran, and so I did a course with this wonderful Californian chap called Ken Ehrman, who turned out to be an absolutely fantastic teacher. and awakened in me the possibility of working with massage, which, with Zoe being in such pain, gave me the opportunity to practice massage, because she literally couldn't sleep at night without being massaged before she went to sleep. So by the time I started training as a herbalist, I'd already been really giving Zoe a lot of massage. Even though I hadn't massaged many people, I'd actually intensively massaged Zoe to help her with the back pain she had suffered. So during my training, I decided, as a herbalist, I thought, well, it'd be a good idea to maybe get qualified in massage, because I can use that alongside my herbal medicine. And so I did a basic ITEC training course in massage in Brighton to get a qualification and get insured. And so I'd already started doing some massage treatments before I qualified as a herbalist. And so that was always a big part, always part of my practice was treating people with massage. And then that evolved into working with that alongside herbal medicine. So once I'd qualified, I was already doing that. In fact, I then, soon after I qualified, I met another local herbalist who had opened up a small shop in a village close to Chichester, and was wanting someone to work there with her, because she could only cover a certain number of hours and wanted the shop to be open longer hours. So I started to develop a practice there. Eventually she actually got pregnant, had a baby after a year. I ran the practice on my own, and then after that, when she returned, I ended up setting up my own practice in Emsworth, and I ran it for 18 years, and became part of the local community within Emsworth by running a shop and a clinic, and eventually after 18 years decided to move my practice home, so that I could spend more time working on growing, gathering, making medicines, rather than the huge amount of effort and time it was running a high street business.
Yes. So yeah, because I think that's something that I've always liked about you. Because the first time I met you, you were doing some like 1-day courses, and it would be doing something with elderberries or whatever.
Yeah.
I think actually that might have been the first one you did that I came to.
Yes. Yeah.
And I liked the way that you, instead of it just being about the plant, the physical thing about the plant, it was also about the stories about the plant,
Yeah.
and what that meant to the gypsies and so on, the sort of, and I found that really fascinating.
Yeah.
So when did you start sort of, because there's obviously a lot of depth in your work with regard to that. So where did that really?
Well, I immediately realised that there was always a backstory to every plant, and what intrigued me was that what we were learning through, in our Materia Medica about the scientific validations of uses of herbs, that they really seem to be validations of traditional use. So the big question is, well, how come traditionally people without, a laboratory to study plants and know that it's antiseptic or it's antiviral or it's anti-inflammatory, how did people know all this stuff? And that immediately connected me in with the stories about the plants, because that tells you why you use it in a particular way, tells you something about the plants. It sort of opens something up, and it leads you back into the knowledge that was held about that plant and how that was communicated through its name, through its story, and how that was a way of keeping our relationship and understanding the plant alive. So I was very interested in the names, the stories, and I then, at one point, I came across a book by a Romany chap called Patrick Jasper Lee, who wrote a very good book called We Borrow the Earth, and that was all about storytelling and about the connection between storytelling and the natural world, and how the two were completely interrelated, how one really told the story of the other. And I then went and spent a year and a half doing a program of sessions with him, following the year through the seasons, exploring the story of the seasons within the Romany tradition, which was very much connected with the elemental story, the seasonal story, which of course then had also tied in with the other aspect of herbal medicine, which I had started to also explore, to do with the traditional Galenic system of medicine, which of course is working with the humours. And of course, the humours align with the elements, which align with the seasons and the temperaments. So all of these things started to come together for me through story, through mythology, through historical use of plants, through folklore, through my experience of plants, through treating patients, through growing them, through making them into medicines. So it all seemed to really come together very much through the stories that were coming out and the stories I was exploring. They kind of became, if you like, the glue that fitted them all together, or the ether in which they all arose from. It was all the story. So storytelling became very much, for me, became the narrative which wove everything together. And I was fortunate enough to find out that at Emerson College, which is a anthroposophical college, a Steiner college in East Sussex, that does storytelling courses. They would run weekend courses with visiting teachers, and many of those were very good storytellers. And so I was able to go to do workshops, their weekend workshops, with some of the most incredible, inspiring, and wonderful storytellers. And work with them, which really extended my understanding and appreciation of our narrative tradition.
Yeah, because obviously Emerson's only just up the road from me.
Yeah.
So is there a story that you could sort of use as an example about a plant use? Because
so
I've heard you tell a few. It's just be nice to.
So many, I mean, one of my early ones, I suppose, that really inspired me was to do with the cowslip. It's a lovely herb, and actually it's not used massively in current, and certainly when I was training herbal medicine. And I had been exploring through working with Jasper Lee, but also been very interested in core shamanism. So I've been doing explorative, imaginative journey work. And one of the ways that to sort of get a deeper understanding of plants was to do a form of explorative journey, with a particular plant. And I'd found growing in a wood one time when I was out doing some explorations, a cowslip flower plant, and so I did a journey with it. And in this journey, really interesting. I really knew very little about cowslip at that point. I didn't really know much of it as far as a herb was concerned. So I did this journey, and in the journey, a couple of really interesting things happened. I found myself by a lake on a beach, and the first thing that happened was a very beautiful woman appeared who was an incredible dancer. And she was doing this absolutely beautiful dance, which was was showing off her ability to do with suppleness and movement and flow. And she was then joined by a much, much older woman, who maybe in some sense seemed to be a grandmother figure, or maybe an elder or teacher figure. And then then it moved on to an experience directly with the flower, where I found myself entering the flower itself and suddenly feeling that the flower became like because it's bell shaped, I entered it and it became like a chamber, and the chamber started pulsating, and immediately it felt to me like the chamber of the heart. And so I had that, and then from then I then had a feeling that I was lying down, and my heart was being opened, and a bird in the form of an owl came and planted the plant actually in my heart. And then I woke up from, finished that journey, and I started looking further into the plant, and I started to learn some really interesting things. One is, the first thing maybe to say is, the plant is ruled by the goddess Venus, and the goddess Venus is associated with we still talk about the venous circulation, so the watery aspect of the heart. So the sun and the moon are considered to both be associated with the heart, one to do with the red arterial circulation and one to do with the blue venous circulation, and so to do with the flow of circulation. The next thing I discovered was that in Culpeper, it's considered to have a very cooling action and to be very particularly protective against anything that burns, scorches, or damages the heart. So it's considered to be a cooling, cordial herb for the heart. And then I came across the story of the goddess Freya, who was said to awaken the world, bring life back to the world after the winter. And as she walked across the fields, her blonde tresses would awaken the flowers, and the cowslip flowers would be an emblem of where she had passed. And it was also an emblem of Freya, because Freya held the doors to paradise, because she was the one who allowed people into Valhalla, which was where, after death, one would continually feast and celebrate. So that was the place of paradise. And the bunch of the flowers of cowslip hang like a bunch of keys. And so they were known as the keys of Freya.
Right.
And then when that became Christianized, one of the names for cowslips was Our Lady's keys, because the Virgin Mary was substituted for Freya. So the story of the plant, and then the different connections to do with paradise, to do with the goddess Venus, to me, it all suddenly made a lot of sense, and I understood how to use that herb, how I could use it to help with excess heat and in the body. Of course, then I went and looked further. Of course, it's used for inflammatory conditions. It's used for also inflammatory conditions of the chest. It's used for bronchitis. It's used for whooping cough. It's also used for joint inflammation and pain and heat. And then again, the suppleness of the dancing girl I saw in my vision, the way that the flowers themselves on their stalks will bend with the wind and won't break. So all of these things sort of fits in with so it's like the story becomes the wisdom becomes the way to use it. The way to use it informs you once again and reinforces the story.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the significance of the owl. That's not the symbol of Freya, is it?
It's strongly associated with the goddess, and the ancient goddess, of course, is represented in the fact that it's ruled by Venus, and of course, the owl associated with vision and with the moon, and the moon associated with flow, and Venus is also associated with flow.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think that's really where it was. So that would be, if you like, an aspect of the goddess, in a sense, bringing the plant to the heart so that you made that strong heart connection with it.
Yes, yeah, brilliant. That's really good, Steve. So you spoke about Patrick Jasper Lee, which was nice to hear about that. But you've done some other things as well, haven't you? You've been interested in other forms of like going back to the African connection.
Yeah. So yes, I went to Africa. Went back to Africa in 2007. I'd met a chap who had been training as a traditional African healer, diviner, Sangoma, in southern Africa, and I was very interested. Now I've read a lot of obviously been to Africa and very felt quite connected with the place. And I'd met a woman. An interesting thing had happened, that a book I'd read, which was called White Woman Witch Doctor, written by Ray Graham, who was a woman who went to South Africa, married a South African in 1946, and had lived in the bush and had always been really interested in African traditions and African medicine, and eventually herself became trained as a bone thrower, as a diviner, and her book's a lovely book to read. And for some bizarre set of circumstances, I had a receptionist at my shop whose best friend's aunt so happened to be that woman.
Oh my God.
Which is a bizarre connection. And my receptionist had met that woman because she had come over, and because she had seen her role as introducing to white people African spirituality to show that it wasn't all mumbo jumbo. My receptionist had once gone along to a WI meeting where this friend's aunt had thrown the bones for the WI.
Wow.
So she said to me, "Oh, you should meet my friend's aunt, because she does come over to England sometimes." And I said, "I'd love to." So it so happened that I had met this lady, Ray Graham, had come to my clinic, and we'd had a bit of a strange connection had happened where we had spoken. I had given her some herbs. She had said some words. And there was a connection. I can't really say much more than that. Anyway, I then met this particular chap, and it so happened that when he'd been at school in South Africa as a white South African, a strange white South African woman had come to his school to talk to them about what the Africans do that isn't all mumbo jumbo. And it's the first experience he'd ever had, being a white South African, of anything to do with Black South Africa. So we had this shared connection, and that led me to, I helped him out, found him some clients to work with, set up some workshops for him, etc., raised some sponsorship money so he could go back to Africa and complete his training. So I was then invited to South Africa to witness his final ceremonies of initiation. And in that way, I met the community that he was working with, and eventually became a trainee within that community, and went through initiation as a diviner in South Africa and as a Sangoma in the South African tradition, which happened over the following sort of 10 years. So it's also quite a long story.
I was going to say, because it's a long process.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not just something that you can flit in and out of, is it?
No. But I think what it sort of says, I mean, it's interesting, as we all get older, we look back on our lives and we do see a kind of narrative that has evolved. And none of it might seem to make a little sense at the time.
No.
But the gifts and the crises all seem to meld together. And hopefully that means that as we become older, we become we develop a greater confidence in what unfolds, both good and bad.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because again, that's sort of what when I'm doing these interviews, that's really what I'm sort of exploring.
Yeah.
Is that even from a very early age, the traits of the character of people are already evident.
Yes, I think so.
And to the point that, like you were saying, your mother being more open to ideas of something other than the particular materialistic, logical perspective of the sort of Western perspective of things. But of course, that going to what you've been talking about just now, that really sort of has grown out. Well, seemingly has grown out of that type of way of thinking.
Yes.
And I see this all the time in talking to people, and it's almost like, well, right from early on. It's not very well. I don't think I've even come across anybody yet in these interviews where they're totally different, and then something happens and they completely change. I haven't experienced that. You
No,
know,
I don't.
people have events like
Yeah.
you know, things that happen, chance
Mm.
meetings, like you've just said, you know, so-called chance meetings that are so peculiar and so synchronicitous, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that happens a lot. But it's already feeding into the things that are already sort of there somehow.
Oh, of course. Yes. 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 There's no
And
doubt.
I think it's only really when you get older that you start looking at that and you
Well, it's only when you can actually see what's happened and weave it together in that way.
yes, I think so. I think that's the thing. I've been thinking quite a lot like this actually recently, but you know, maybe it's that type of thing as you get older, it's just like the very nature of things, like takes you longer to get out of bed in the morning. You know what I mean? Takes you longer to wake up. And in that sort of moment when you're trying to wake up, you have deep thoughts, which
Yeah.
perhaps I never did when I was younger, because you know, you're just awake.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I just sort of thought about that and thought, well, you know, maybe that's just the way it is. Just you get to
Yeah.
that certain point and you've got time because
Yeah.
you have to
Yes.
allow time to wake up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, what would you say about the training from the the point of view of would you use the word Sangoma? How's that? I would say changed. You know, how's that coloured your look
Yeah.
of what you
So
do?
I think what was very interesting for me is that the nub of it was about initiation, because as Westerners we don't experience initiation. So it was an opportunity to go through a traditional initiation, set of initiation, which of course is what's always happened in cultures and always happened as part of one's evolution, um, as a to gain mastery of anything. It's about being able to dissolve that which has restricted us and become something that is new, and to learn how that can be possible and how to enable us to continue to do that so that we remain fresh and vital, but
Mm,
also how we can enable others to do that in their lives so that they can transform themselves from places of suffering into places of joyfulness and um, fulfillment. So I think that's what I learned. That's what it was all about. It wasn't necessarily learning a new tradition. It was
yeah.
being able to experience that directly, that through death, even though it's in a sense, you could say it's a virtual death. It's a ritual death rather than a physical death. Um, Through death, renewal arises, and being able to have the confidence to allow that death to occur. Um, uh, 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 and to know how to facilitate that in other people.
Mm. That's a really good point. So, what's the obviously we're all in a bit of a weird time at the moment.
Yeah.
Um, so, what are you're obviously working, doing
Yes.
your healing work. So,
Yeah.
how do you how do, how do I sort of say this? It's not really a case of planning anything. Um, have you? Because I know you've got a book sort of floating around somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. My book's hopefully published in the next year, although I was very quite late at getting it completed, which is
It's done,
exploring.
is it? It is done.
It is done. It was due to be published March 21, but it's going to be delayed by at least 6 months.
All right.
And it's called The Humoral Herbal. So it's mainly really about just trying to put a mark in the sand about the Western tradition of herbal medicine, the Western energetic tradition, where it's come from, how we can use it today effectively as practitioners,
Hmm.
how it can be a way, a viewpoint which we can easily adopt because it is a cultural viewpoint we're familiar with, to in a sense have a really effective way of working with the plants we're working with, whether it's for ourselves or for other people, and just opening a door so that we can find our own way of developing that relationship, but using the humoral language, which is embedded in our own language and literature and culture, as a way of, in a sense, reviving that culture and tradition, awakening it from its dormant state, so that it can be useful for us in every way. How we relate to one another, how we relate to the planet, seasons, to the medicines we use, to the plants, to the diets we're having. So yeah, that's really what it is. It's not trying to set out a specific structure and dogma that needs to be adhered to, but it was important for me to say, well, this is what they said about it, and this is the way I understand what they said about it and how I've used it. So people know, can use that as maybe a starting point, or as a sort of staging post in their own experience and exploration of what has come from our culture as Europeans, and how we can continue to evolve that, if you like, that mystical culture, and our relationship with the planet and the plants we use for healing.
That's brilliant. Right, well, Steve, I think that's a good place
That's
to.
lovely. Thank you. My power's running out anyway, so.
All right, okay. So there's a good spot to stop. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, and I'll put the details of how people can contact you in the show notes. All right.
Thank you.
So
thank you very much.
You're well. Wish you all the best, and thanks ever so much, Steve. It's great talking to you, as always.
It's been a pleasure.
Right.
Bye then.
Bye. Thank you to Steve. I really like going into the sort of background of how people arrive at what they do, and this particular episode was really interesting from that point of view, because I didn't know an awful lot about Steve's backstory, and although I've known Steve for quite some time and done a little bit of sort of study with herbal law with him, I was unaware of all his journeying, so that was particularly interesting for me. Again, all the stuff's in the show notes, and read them up and follow that and check out Steve and his book that's coming out. And until next time, see you then. Bye.